Hello everyone, we're very pleased to have picked your interest in our today's workshop, The Art of Negotiation, and feel honored to occupy the next hour of your time and attention. Let's start with a short introduction. My name is Nikolai Stoikov, and I have been working as a German M&A and corporate lawyer for almost 8 years now. I have had the pleasure to be involved in more than 40 M&A transactions, financing round, and restructurings. Now to my colleagues, maybe ladies first.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Nikolai. Hello, everyone. My name is Soraya Carrera from the Spanish law firm Monereo Meyer Abogados. I specialize in all kinds of real estate and construction law matters and have experience in transactions mostly with foreign real estate funds, institutional investors, banks, and project developers. I also participate in legal due diligence processes and provide advice on matters relating to asset management, especially the leasing.
Hello to all attendees from me. My name is Pavlina Ivanova and I'm a real estate lawyer from Bulgaria, part of Dimitrov Petrov and Co law firm. My practice normally includes daily negotiations, so I would be very happy to share my experience with you.
Hello as well, my name is Michal Michalek and I work at the Slovakian office in Taylor Wessing in Bratislava for almost 10 years now. I focus on servicing national and international clients in a wide range of matters related to corporate law, M&A, commercial law, and insolvency law. My job is to lead or to take part in legal due diligence processes, M&A negotiations, and to provide legal advice concerning deal structuring.
Thank you very much. Our today's workshop will be held with my colleagues Soraya, Pavlina, and Michael in an open discussion format. And we're very happy to share with you our personal practical experience on the topic of successful negotiation. In advance, some notes to our participants out there. Your audio connection is deactivated. However, you may ask any questions you might have in the special question room during the workshop, and we'll then be very happy to answer them in the course of our discussion. We would also like to invite you to take 2 polls during the workshop, and we will then share and analyze the outcome of the survey at the end. And one last note, the workshop will be video recorded and published on our website, and each participant will receive an email with the link and with our PowerPoint presentation of today. So let's start our discussion, and maybe with the most obvious question here, and this is what makes a negotiation successful, or how would you define a successful negotiation? A corresponding poll should have just started. And the question just in the round of the colleagues, how would you define a successful negotiation?
So let me illustrate, or should I wait a minute?
No, you can just
okay.
go forward. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, let me illustrate with the following example of a successful negotiation. We had a client who wanted to acquire an office building located in Madrid through a European hotel fund. For the purpose was he wanted to convert this office building in a hotel with 300 rooms. So this meant that in addition to the legal due diligence and the negotiations with the seller, we also had to carry out negotiations with the general contractor and the lessee of the future hotel. And furthermore, part of the ground floor of the office building was still leased, and this lease agreement needed to be terminated before signing any public deed. The question was that the negotiations with the general contractor and with the lessee of the future hotel were lasting longer than initially planned. But for our client, it was very necessary. It was necessary above all to ensure that these agreements were going to be signed in order to be able to purchase the office building logically. And at one point of the negotiations, the seller flatly refused to terminate the current lease agreement. before the granting of the public deed of sale and purchase, because the seller said, yeah, it was a monthly income for him. Also because the agreed deadline with the purchaser ended, and he didn't see that the purchasers wanted to buy the building. He didn't know certain if it finally would be there, if they would sign purchase the deed of the sale and purchase. So everything was a little bit. The seller was a little bit stressed. So and for our client, the most important part was that it was necessary for him to begin the purchase, to buy the building without any free of lessees, occupants, or anything. So because he wanted to acquire, he had to acquire this building, and then as soon as possible start with the remodeling work. So finally, our client signed with the general contractor and the lessee the agreements, and our client take into consideration that the current lease only occupied a part of the ground floor. Our client evaluated the risk and finally accepted subrogating itself in the lease agreement, even though that it meant that the start with the remodeling works would be delayed a few weeks. So finally, at the notary's office, when we signed the public deed for sale and purchase, the parties sent the usual joint notification to the current lessee, indicating the transfer of the building and the termination of the lease agreement. As well, they set a date on which the building needed to be empty. And in addition, and this was the important part for our client, that the seller accepted including a guarantee in the sale and purchase deed in case that the current lessee did not leave the building empty and the date indicated. The guarantee was consisted in paying a compensation for the purchaser with a cap calculated depending on the extra days or weeks the lessee continued to occupy the building until its final exit. So for me, it was an example. This shows a successful negotiation situation, because despite the fact that the transaction took way too long, the seller finally came to understand the complexity of our client's project, and our client accepted to purchase a building with a tenant.
I would say it was a great achievement from your side to receive this seller's concession for the guarantee. This was really a big achievement. Just one note also to the participants: you can vote on the poll in the special poll room. There is one question room and one poll room. Pavlina, would you like to share with us?
Yes, sure. I just want to share a few words regarding the poll. I can now see the results, and yes, the result which gets the more votes, which are not a lot until now, is you get an outcome which accomplishes the needs of both sides. Yes, this is very important too. And in this regards, I would like to also share one such experience of ours from the last months of successful negotiations. So one of our clients owned a plot in Sofia and was interested in its construction. So he engaged one of the leading Bulgarian construction companies to perform the construction of the plot, and the company executed the construction, commissioned the building, and rendered the possession of the residential building to our client. As soon as he received the possession, however, he decided to perform a water check of the roof structure of the building. He, however, forgot to notify the contractor regarding the test, and therefore the test was performed without the participation and without the consent of the contractor. As a result of the test, leakage was caused, and it caused damages to the units located in some of the units located in the building. Our client was convinced that this leakage was due to poor quality of the construction of the building, and the contractor, of course, was not very agreed to this position, and he stated that the leakage was due to non-properly performing of the test and excessive water loading of the roof. So both parties started to dispute of which party is going to repair the damages caused. Our client, of course, wanted the contractor to repair the damages, and the contractor claimed that he's not going to repair anything, and in addition, he will consider his warranty liability waived for the building for future defects. So we started really tough negotiations between the two parties. And after a few meetings, what they finally achieved as a result of the negotiations was the following. They decided to split the expenses necessary for the repair. So the contractor would repair the damages, and our client would pay half of the expenses for the repair. And thus both parties were finally okay with the settlement, because they saved a lot of expenses which they would otherwise invest in litigation, and this also allowed our client to timely handle his obligations to the purchasers of the damaged units. Thank you, and I would like to hear the example of Michael.
Thank you very much. So let me demonstrate my perception of a successful negotiation on the following example. A couple of years ago, together with our M&A and corporate team in Bratislava, we advised an international client that was aiming to acquire a local Slovakian production company. We performed a due diligence process that discovered multiple transactional risks. So this led us to the recommendation for the client to pull this deal through in the form of an asset deal. Both the buyer and the seller were generally happy and ready to go forward with the asset deal. However, due to the requests of the competent regulatory authorities, it turned out to be more feasible for the client to continue the operation of the targeted business under the existing entity, which was mainly related to the client's time frame for integrating the targeted business to its structure. So we had to go back to the table with the seller and renegotiate the conditions for closing of this transaction in the form of a share deal. The share deal, of course, made the transaction more complicated and increased the buyer's requirements on transactional documentation So concessions were to be negotiated in connection with the increased risks to be assumed by the client, and the proposed original purchase price was to be renegotiated as well. Both the buyer and the seller were, however, in the right mindset. They were listening to the requests of the other party, were open to finding mutually acceptable solutions. So once the parties agreed on the new terms, the negotiations with the regulatory authorities could continue with the aim to secure stability for the buyer for future operation of the acquired local company. All parties, including the regulatory authority, had the common goal, which was to make sure that the targeted company will seamlessly continue its operations through the transaction and post the transaction, and that there is a guarantee that it will also continue its operations in the future. The transaction was a great example of that, with the right mindset, openness, and proposed openness to the proposed solutions and common goals, and the right time frame. Everything is indeed negotiable, and it in the end led to a three-way win transaction.
Thank you, Michael. Just one question from my side. How long does it take, the whole negotiation process in your example?
This one was really long. That's why at the end of the day, it was decided to switch from the asset deal to the share deal, because it was simply since the negotiations took so long, it was no longer viable to set up a new entity to get all the licensing needed and so on to simply seamlessly continue with the operation. So they had to go to a shared unit.
Thank you to my colleagues for the very interesting examples. I also have a favorite example that best illustrates my personal understanding of a successful negotiation. Our client was a purchaser who wanted to acquire a German operating company. And this company, the target company, owned its own operational property. So at the end, the client acquired the company plus the properties. In the course of our legal due diligence process, we discovered a certain environmental risk. There were contaminated sites buried in the ground under the buildings. And this meant that by purchasing the properties, our client would assume automatically the environmental liability for the contaminated sites, for their cleanup and disposal. So what we did is to call in an environmental expert, and he estimated the risk, and he came to a rough estimate at about 2 million euro. Of course, our reaction was to demand a corresponding indemnity from the seller side. You can imagine that the seller was not really amused, and he was not readily prepared to grant the environmental indemnity to our client, and for two reasons. The first one was that the deal was his golden ticket to his carefree retirement, and he did not want to bother with our client about any indemnities in future. And the second argument, this was really a strong one. He said, well, at the time of signing of this deal, basically you don't have any real liability because the contaminated sites are buried in the ground, and no environmental authority would come to you and demand from you any disposal or cleanup right now. But in future, so our client as the new owner, in future, if you decide to demolish the buildings or to reconstruct them, and that's why you'd dig up the contaminated sites to the surface, it would be your own fault. It would be your own action. So you would materialize this liability case. That's why should I then be liable for something which is now only potential? As I said, the argument was a strong one. That's why we had to interrupt the negotiation round and to discuss internally with the client how he would like to propose further. From legal point of view, there was no right or wrong option. Either you have the indemnity or not. It was more a business decision of our client with, of course, significant commercial impact. And he said, well, basically, I want this deal because it's not a deal breaker to me to have identified this risk, because I expect profitable company development in future and synergy effects as well. And also, I don't plan any concrete construction measures in the near future, let's say in the next 2 to 3 years. On the other hand, I cannot foresee the future. I don't know whether we will abandon the building, let's say in 10 years, or we'll sell the buildings to a third party. That's why I'd like to assume up to 50% of the risk, but nothing more. I'd like to share 50-50 with the seller side, because otherwise it does not feel fair to assume all 100% of the risk. Then we said to the client, okay, let's have this discussion at business level only between you and the seller without legal advisors. They did so, and 30 minutes later they had the deal. They decided, okay, we will share 50-50. And it was interesting, the mechanism of sharing. Initially, we requested an environmental indemnity, but we received final concession from seller side in the form of a purchase price reduction of 1 million euro for the properties, equaling to the 50% of the estimated risk. So at the end, the deal was signed, closed, and everybody was happy. Maybe to put the commercial dimensions into perspective, we had this particular deal where the purchase price for the company was 70 million euro, and the purchase price for the properties was 10 million euro. And at the end, the seller received 79 million euro instead of 80 million euro. Whether this would be a deal breaker if we had only the properties as the object of purchase, this remains, of course, an open question here. So now let's take a closer look at how these examples constitute a successful negotiation. I would say in these examples, the three pillars of successful negotiation, these are the right mindset, the right process, and the right execution played a decisive role. And I would say also that these examples prove the truth of the two basic and well-known concepts, that everything is negotiable and a better deal can be found if you ask. I would say our culture discourages real negotiation. If you think about it, everything around us has a printed price as a way to discourage us from negotiating. And the same effect applies when we see, let's say, an agreed purchase price amount in a letter of intent signed between the parties, even prior to conducting any due diligence process and even prior to negotiating the key definite transaction terms and conditions. And it is also a very favorite argument from seller side, just referring to the agreed letter of intent and say, well, we have already agreed on the key terms and conditions or on the purchase price amount. I don't accept any deviations from the letter of intent. But as a professional negotiator, we know that that such agreement under the letter of intent is always subject to a satisfactory due diligence process and to negotiating really adequate terms and conditions which reflect the major due diligence findings. So the message here is, if you are the message here to all purchasers out there is that after you have completed your due diligence process, then please ask yourself, is there a better deal? Can I do this deal in a better way? And this means if you have identified major due diligence problems, then feel confident and please deviate from the agreed term sheet or letter of intent. You can do this very confidently. And on the other hand, if the message to all sellers out there is, of course, if the purchaser comes to you with such a request, then please ask the purchaser for a detailed explanation of the identified and estimated risks, and then double check with your advisors whether and to what extent such objections or risks are really justified.
Yes, I would say it's a common motivation of the buyer to carry out the due diligence in order to achieve some sort of adjustment of the initially expected purchase price. So as you mentioned in your example, you had the issue with the environmental risk. In such cases, it's always good to be able to put a price tag on every major issue you simply discover in the due diligence, which also then helps with framing the initial post-due diligence talks with the seller and with better management of the expectations of both parties. So it's just a better way to simply go more effectively forward.
Absolutely. Then it is also important as an element of the right mindset, it is important to understand that the negotiation is a kind of process of convergence. If you know your own needs and also the needs of the other party, then your negotiation process has to converge to an agreement which fulfills the needs of both parties. And in order to understand how to do this, first of all, it's important to know the difference between the two types of negotiation. There is the distributive one and there is the integrative one. In the case of the distributive negotiation, you have just a fixed pie, which will be divided between the parties. And the one will get logically more and the other will get less out of this negotiation pie. Speaking in practice, this is always the case when you negotiate only on one single item. For example, on the purchase price amount or on the question whether a certain repaint warranty or indemnity should be granted, or when you argue with the seller about his liability cap amount or any liability limitations. And this is the situation which should be avoided because both parties are really in their flight or fight mode. It's aggressive, and basically neither party wants to be the one that gets, of course, less of the negotiation pie. The better approach is the integrative negotiation. This is the case when you bring several issues at once on the negotiation table and then start trading your most crucial or most important objectives you want to achieve against the most crucial issues which the other party would like to just get away from the negotiation. And by doing this kind of trade, you really enlarge the negotiation pie because certain compromise and alternative solutions will come up. So if we so define the win-win negotiation, I would say that also in our 4 examples, we had exactly a win-win situation. In my example, for example, we traded our initial request for environmental indemnity against seller's final concession to a purchase price reduction. How about in your examples? How do you define what were your trades of?
Well, in my example, we traded timely repair of the defects, which was very important for our client because he was pressured by the purchasers of the damaged unit, and we preserved the contractor's liability, and for that we paid half of the expenses due for the repair.
In our case, we listened to the seller and the regulating authorities, and they listened to us. Both parties were willing to make concessions to balance out the risks to be assumed by the buyer and to adjust the initial expectations concerning the commercial terms and conditions of the deal. The exchange of information, its understanding and coming up with the right solution was key in this transactional negotiations. So I would say what was very important for us in this deal was to explain the issues or the individual items in a way that was understandable for the other party.
Well, in my case, the seller and the purchaser were comprehensive with each other and both made concession. The purchaser exceeded the deadline by far, but agreed finally to purchase the office building with a lessee. And meanwhile, the seller agreed to introduce a compensation to the purchaser in case the lessee did not leave the space within the agreed date.
Great.
Oops, sorry. Okay, as I think we're continuing here to break down what makes a successful negotiation a success. So I will just continue with the factor of information. As I already mentioned, one of the key factors of a successful negotiation is the understanding of the information you are receiving during the transactional process, including the negotiational phase, of course. To get a good understanding of the information, you should be able to identify the position and the interest. Simply put, position is what you want or what the opposite party wants, and the interest is why you want it or why the opposite party wants it. For example, if you want to reduce the purchase price because you have discovered a risk that can negatively affect the value of the purchased asset, in order to negotiate out the reduction with the seller, you need to have an understanding for both the risk and the proposed solution. And you need to be able to explain both the risk and the proposed solution to the seller so that he also gains sufficient understanding. You should also, if you have enough information and a good understanding of the information, you should also be able to come up with alternatives and have an understanding if there are any possibilities of other outcomes. So to be able to understand correctly and to identify the position and the interest as a good negotiator, you need to have a solid initial information basis. Without that, the negotiation will simply not be effective, or nor will be effective the work that is put in by your advisors. So without sufficient information, you will either come up with solutions that are not completely suitable for the present case, which does not help with the convergence at all, or you will not be able to make the big final decisions. So my recommendation is always ask for additional information and explanations if you feel that you do not have enough information that enables you to identify and understand the issues, the possible solutions and outcomes. Good initial information basis usually opens a wider variety of solutions and outcomes, which means the understanding enables you to prepare a negotiation strategy. And it also promotes an effective and constructive discussion with the opposite party. This is, of course, something that has to be explained to the opposite party or their advisors from time to time to make sure that they understand that if they're transparent towards you, you will simply proceed more effectively. So the importance of the factor information should be already clear. Of course, there are clients, especially sellers, who sometimes have ideas of how not to be completely transparent as regards some particular items. From my experience, this is, however, usually not very fruitful and tends to backfire. A better way forward is usually to set the right strategy for when to disclose what information and to provide answers to the questions you are asked and not to the questions that were not asked. The factors time and power play an important role as well. Time is sometimes used for increasing pressure on the opposite party. It is also used towards the advisors very oftenly, such as lawyers or tax advisors, to limit their possibility to review and evaluate the disclosed documents and information, and to limit their time for marking up and drafting documentation. From my point of view, as an advisor, I'm generally fine, not really happy, but fine with short time limits and deadlines, because they usually lead to a quicker and swifter closing of the transaction. But in such case, I always try to explain to the client that the risk that we will miss something increases, and that dealing with a particular issue might only be postponed to a later date. Power is, from my point of view, closely connected with the information basis you have at your disposal. The larger information basis you have, the more complex your negotiation strategy can be. This means you can make more alternatives and more outcomes viable. It is also it also allows you to set a strategy for when to use which piece of information to achieve your goals. Power is, of course, doesn't refer to any force or damage or restrictions. It simply refers to the, let's say, cards you hold in your hands in the negotiations. Yeah.
Okay. Good. So let me share my opinion on the factors time, information, power. Just a small example. When we advise, for example, purchasers, for all of us, the starting point is logically to prepare this infinite checklist we all have, and we adapt it to each transaction, where the seller enters his comments and starts uploading all the documents to the virtual data room. And I think for me, this checklist is sometimes underestimated, but it gives so much information and power over the negotiations, and logically more for the purchaser. So, and I think it's also key to organizing the time factor. I think for me, it's even usual that these checklists are attached as an annex to the deed of sale and purchase. So the seller should be very careful what they put on it. And sometimes I cannot explain why we are until the last moment still discussing this checklist, but it happens often.
Thank you very much for this input and example. Finally, for our right mindset as a successful negotiator, we must know we should be always perceived as honest, fair, and acting in integrity. So the message here is let the other party save face every single time. Otherwise, your negotiation will turn distributive one. And also if you overact and then you just force, then the other party perceives to be treated unfairly, they could tear down the deal even at their own cost. So what you have to avoid is in any situation to force the other party play the so-called ultimatum game. Dear participants, a survey should have just started on your screens with the title The Ultimatum Game, and the rules of the game are as follows. I have received €100 note with the condition that I must make you an offer to share the amount. In case you accept my offer, then we may keep the money and divide it accordingly. In case you reject my offer, then I have to return the €100 and nobody from us will get anything. So you now have the possibility to choose which proposals you would like to reject or you would reject. I just wondered, dear colleagues, did you have a situation, a negotiation situation which turned to or escalated to an ultimatum game?
Yes, I'm sure that all of us had such a situation, unfortunately, but I would like to share one such experience. Firstly, I would agree here that the ultimatum game situation rarely results in a successful negotiation. I would like to share one successful experience, however, highlighting that using these tactics has an unpredictable outcome in the majority of cases. So one of our clients was interested to purchase a plot situated in the center of one of the Bulgarian seaside cities, a very beautiful plot, very near the sea, surrounded by greenery. And our client was completely in love with this plot and had the plans to construct a luxurious residential building in the plot. So with our assistance, our client concluded a preliminary agreement to purchase the plot. And having signed such an agreement, he invested funds in research and designing of the future construction in the plot. Meanwhile, however, our team was informed that a third party registered injunction on the plot. So, having understood this information, we and the owner of the plot, our seller, had to enter into negotiations with the company which registered the injunction. During the conversation with this company, we found out that it claimed amounts from the owner of the plot, and having found out that we are interested to purchase the plot, of course, used this opportunity to receive some share of the price. So this company knew its very favorable position in the negotiations because of the injunction, of course, and knew that our client was really interested to purchase the plot. And thus, it demanded immediate payments and a lot of guarantees. We, on the other side, knew that this company is not willing to participate in litigation procedure against the former owner of the plot and was desperately needing settlement. Knowing this information, we decided to declare to this company that either they accept our final proposal for agreement, or we will step back from the negotiations and we will search for another plot to invest in. To be honest, this was really a risky decision and we didn't know what would be the outcome, and our client really liked the plot and wanted to purchase it. So at least 1 or 2 hours we were sitting by the phone, crossing fingers and hoping that this outcome will be successful for us. Luckily, the company with the injunction accepted our offer, and we finally managed to sign the agreement. But I should admit that the result could be anything. This situation could have forced them just to refuse to talk to us anymore and to refuse to sign any agreements with us. But yes, sometimes even ultimatum-based situations are successful for both parties.
Well, you played well in this situation. Then when we go to the right process, we must know that the negotiation is basically a process. This is not an event. And it has 4 stages. The first one is the preparation. I personally am a big believer in the Pareto principle and always try to find the 20% that lead to the 80% outcome. And from my experience in negotiations, the 20% factors that lead to the 80% negotiation outcome is usually the good preparation. And in order to adequately prepare for a negotiation round, I try to determine and evaluate both parties' interests in the deal, the best alternatives of both parties to negotiating this certain agreement, the walkaway price of both parties, and based on this, the zone of a possible agreement. Within this zone of a possible agreement, you must be aware of your milestones, or I would say these are the most important objectives you want to achieve and the most crucial issues you want to get away from negotiation. Then your options or trade-offs, or which compromises and concessions are you ready to make? And more important, what would you like to get in return for your concessions? And the market standards should be also kept in mind as a kind of fairness corrective. And only in case the negotiation just does not lead to an agreement or to a compromise, it is always a good idea to have something like a message to be addressed to the other party, to bring them to rethinking their positions and to reopen room for negotiation. In other words, just to bring them back to the negotiation table. Do you have any memorable message situations?
I have such situation. What I would like to add here is that indeed message situations do not happen oftenly. They are rare in our practice, but they happen. And sometimes it's really more important to send a message to the other party than to receive the successful negotiations right now. So one such experience from my practice is we represented a big retail company which entered the Bulgarian market a few years ago, and at that time was expanding its locations in the country. So we entered into negotiations with a lessor for a premise located in a retail center, which the lessor would had to construct after the conclusion of the lease agreement. The premise was really interesting for our client, and therefore he was very flexible and reasonable during the negotiations. However, they did not go smoothly. The lessor was presented really harsh non-market conditions and refused to amend them. After a few meetings, we understood that this retail center was actually the first step of the lessor in the retail business. So he didn't have enough knowledge of the market conditions, and he didn't have enough lease agreements, which he has concluded with other major brands. So what we decided was to step back from the negotiations for a few months, give the opportunity to the lessor to gain knowledge of the market conditions, to conclude a few lease agreements with other brands. Hopefully, as a result, he will be more flexible. Indeed, After a few months, when we returned to the negotiations with the lessor, he was far more flexible, and we ended up concluding a reasonable lease agreement, which was beneficial for both parties.
Well, great message situation. Then let's go back to the second stage of the negotiation process. This is the discovery meeting, or this is actually the negotiation meeting itself. And in my opinion, each negotiation meeting has two goals. The first one, and this is of course the primary, to achieve an agreement between the parties. But I would say it is really an exceptional case if both parties really achieve an agreement on 100% of each single open point between them on the very first day of negotiation. So that's why we should keep in mind the second goal of such discovery meeting, and this is to discover the unknowns, or in other words, try to learn as much as possible about the interests, the arguments, the considerations, and the motives of your counterpart behind their positions. Then the next stage is the brainstorm session. It always depends on how smooth the negotiation round just goes. If there are only, I would say, 2-3 open points between the parties and the deal must be done quickly, then it is always a good idea just to interrupt the negotiation round and to internally discuss with the client and work with the client on a very quick and pragmatic solutions. Basically, these are always a kind of compromise solutions between the parties. If otherwise you have a really heated discussion and you argue about 20-30 minutes only one single point, then the best thing you could do is just park the open issues and go forward with the next points. And then I would say just sleep for a night on the open points, and the next day you'd be in a much better position to consider your own positions, or also to submit any alternative proposals or compromises, and then you just negotiate further. And then last but not least, the decision stage. It is always good to take the lead and to have the lead during the negotiation process. And what does it mean? This means you should always try to negotiate on the basis of your very last markup, circulated to the other party just before the meeting. Secondly, when you meet, then propose to take the minutes of the negotiation so that you have the control over the writing down of the positions of the parties and any achieved agreements or proposed alternatives or compromises. And third, it's always a good idea to propose to the other party to be the one that prepares the next markup to the transaction documents on the basis of your minutes. And last but not least, it's always good to have to be the first to announce your decision after you have, let's say, a negotiation round with an ultimatum, or where really unknown alternative proposals have been submitted. Then you have the power to say your, as the first person to say your decision and your opinion on these. There is this saying, plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. And actually, in the negotiation, in the context of negotiation, I would say that preparation is really indispensable. However, I'm pretty sure that no one from us ever experienced a really smooth negotiation meeting without any surprising points.
Yes. Even the transaction I was talking about at the beginning when describing a successful negotiation is such an example. The turning point in this case, points in this case where the requests laid down by the regulatory authorities and the time frame the client has put in for integrating the target into its structure. Due to them, it was necessary to rethink, restructure, and renegotiate the entire transaction, and basically all initial plans, except for the main one, which was to acquire the local target, flew out of the window. Another example from my experience is from a deal in which our client had very particular and complex visions and plans how to commercially and business-wise close a deal, with a comprehensive incentive scheme for the key personnel at the target. The initial planning phase was therefore almost entirely dedicated to figuring out legal ways how to carry out these plans and schemes under the limitations and requirements stemming from Slovak law. The incentive schemes and the plans of the clients were originally, of course, construed under the laws of a completely different jurisdiction from Slovakia. So it was technically, legally quite a challenge, but we, at the end of the day, came to a solution that was working under Slovak law. However, during the negotiations, it then turned out that one of a particular one event that was foreseen by the client under the scheme would occur under Slovak law automatically, which was not from the legal point, not an issue at all. But the client was simply not in line with the client's way he was used to organize his business and to negotiate. So this, along with some other risks that were discovered in the later phase of the negotiation, led the client to rethink and restructure the terms and conditions for closing of the deal. Another example from my experience is from a transaction that at the outset looked like a simple asset deal, but then required a very complex and complicated legal solution, including exhausting legal negotiations. This was mainly due to the requirements from the buyers. We were representing the seller here, and the buyer's tax advisors and financial advisors came with their requirements on how to simply pull this deal through. This was an example of how important it was to sufficiently explain the requirements to the opposite party in a way that allows them to understand the position, your position and interest. Since in this case, it almost looked like at the beginning that the parties will walk away from the deal once the buyer's advisors have formulated their requirements and recommendations without providing throughout solutions.
It is indeed very important to sufficiently explain your requirements to the other party, and I will add to sufficiently explain your requirements in the right moment, because my favorite surprising negotiations is always the kind of when you already have scheduled a date for the signing, you agreed on all terms and conditions of the settlement agreement, and you go to the notary's office, you almost grab the pen to sign the agreement, and then the other party opens one really important matter, which you already agreed, of course, but the other party is trying to improve its positions. So my message here is, please, if you have unresolved issues during negotiations, don't resolve them at the signing. Unfortunately, this happens, and it's popular in Bulgaria. I don't know why, maybe because people think that when you go to the notary's office, you already imagine the agreement signed, and you already imagine your plans fulfilled regarding the transaction, and thus you would be more flexible to accept conditions which weren't agreed before. But anyway, this isn't considered an honest approach. So if you have unresolved matters, take the phone and schedule another meeting and discuss them once again.
Yes, it happens to us on occasions that just some days before the signing of the deed, we are still renegotiating some points of the agreement, or even at the same moment at the notary's office. And just before signing, it happens that there is still some changes to do at the clauses, or normally they are minor ones. I had a case in which we also represented the purchaser, and we were already at the notary's office, and we were checking all the documents again, and everything was prepared. And Then, out of nowhere, a major discrepancy appeared in the land registry, and we could see that because the notary's office have always updated information from the public registers, and this was now a huge problem for our client. We had to, at the notary, we had to evaluate the risk, if it is a deal breaker, if we could postpone it to another day, the signing. For our client, it wasn't a deal breaker, but he wanted a bank guarantee from the seller, so an important one, a bank guarantee of 6 million euros. Was the third part of the entire transaction. So our client was willing to sign the deed if the seller could provide a bank guarantee. So he had to call the bank came to the notary, so we finally could sign it that day because we couldn't postpone it because of the client. He had to go back to his country and everything. But yes, it's not usual, this one, that at the last moment appears something, but this one, yes, you really never know. Until the deed is signed, you really never know what could happen.
I absolutely agree. Let us now get a bit psychological. There are basically 6 principles of influence, which are universal and to which our human nature basically responds. The first one, this is the so-called confirmation bias. Basically, we really love receiving yeses to our demands from our counterparts. However, we must know if we direct the question very aggressively, a yes-oriented question, very direct and very aggressive, then this makes the other side get defensive. They start to worry what they are letting themselves in for. That's why instead of a very aggressive yes question, you can try starting your question with, are you against, or would you disagree, or is it a ridiculous idea if? The next one, this is the addictive no. Basically, people really feel very comfortable saying no. And the best thing about it is that they then start explaining themselves why they would like to deny your proposal. So as a kind of, they try to apologize themselves for denying. And then they furnish you really with very valuable information about their motives, about their considerations, even fears behind their positions. That's why this is a nice trick to get more information about the background. The so-called anchoring effect, this is our tendency to rely much too heavily on the very first piece of information offered to us as a kind of anchor when we make decisions. And the best way to overcome this anchoring effect is just to start to think about the arguments of the other party, why wants the other party from you a certain concession or compromise. The tactical empathy is very important too. Please avoid aggressive denials and loud disagreements. They won't help you further in the negotiation process. Instead, please radiate calmness and use tactical empathy, meaning if you are confronted with ridiculous, unacceptable demands, then you should start with, okay, state understanding for the needs and interests of the other party, but without necessarily agreeing to it. And then lower their positions, their expectations, by just stating and highlighting your own interests and considerations. And then if you have a room for compromise, then you can switch to the question, is it a ridiculous idea if, and then you propose your compromise. If there is no room for compromise because it's really ridiculous, then you should switch to the question, you just ask the counter question, how am I supposed to do this? So that the other side must now explain and give you some more explanation why this demand, where does it come? Then we have the loss aversion. The loss aversion bias, this means that we really prefer avoiding losses to acquiring equivalent gains. This is very popular in the capital market practice. So and this explains why your counterpart will always have the inner struggle with itself when we want from our counterparts some kind of concession or to give up a part of their position. And the key here is, again, please be nice and gentle to your counterpart. And last but not least, stay flexible. This means, as I said, if you are confronted with unacceptable terms, then instead of loud disagreement, just ask, how am I supposed to do this? And on the other side, you must know it's a part of the game of the successful negotiation to make concessions. But when you make concessions, then you must make the other party work for these concessions. So you must really ask something in return, to receive something in return. To my colleagues, did you have any certain particular experience with these principles in your practice?
Yes, from my experience, the first 5 principles you have described generally apply in the way you said, Nikolai. The only slight exception is maybe the first one. In Slovakia, people usually do not feel too uncomfortable when you ask them to confirm particular items or things. Staying flexible, however, is a bit tricky in Slovakia. It simply works to a certain point. You can always try to ask the opposite party for more and more concessions and try to always offer them something in return. But once you have reached the limit they are no longer willing to cross, it does not matter what you offer them in return. They will just jam, and the only solution how to go forward is then to completely change the game, forget about what was agreed before, and come up with new complex solutions.
Yes, in Bulgaria as well, all the principles apply. I would say that it's a little bit more possible here to meet a little bit more aggressive negotiator. In these cases, you really should remain calm, should be empathetic, flexible, kind, because when disputes with such negotiators arise, it is really very easy to make the mistake of saying too much and listening too little. And in negotiations, both parties should be presented with the equal possibility to present their case and to feel that their point of view has been taken into consideration.
Yes, I agree with Paulina. And also, and I think the most of the times when one of the parties is from another country, you really need to know which principles are more important for that party and adapt a little bit to it, or at least to be more comprehensive and always be open-minded. I think it's very important. And for example, in Spain, we usually are very flexible but analyze everything. So maybe we analyze too much. But maybe for your foreign client, being too flexible or too empathetic causes distrust. So therefore, I think it's important to bear in mind the cultural aspect when we talk about these principles.
Great, thank you. Since we're a bit running out of time, we then go to the end of our workshop, and basically would like to summarize the key principles in negotiations. Here's the title is M&A negotiations, but basically these key principles are applicable to every business negotiation. It depends on which side of the table you're sitting. If you are the seller, then you should be aware, or you should have thought about buyers' motives in acquiring your business, or what are buyers' interests. Then buyers' resources, or what are the best alternatives of the buyer to negotiating an agreement with you. And then buyers' plans. This means how flexible and how open to options buyers' positions are. And if you are the purchaser, then you must think about seller's reasons and interests in selling its business or company, seller's price rationale, or what is the zone of possible agreement on price, terms, and conditions, and also sellers' alternatives to no sale, or where lies the walkaway price of the seller. And then remember and apply the following 5 key takeaways for your negotiation process. Basically, the best offer and the best agreement is always a mixture of price, terms, and conditions. And negotiation is basically a process of convergence. This is not just a battle of positions. It is important to take the lead and to stay at the same time flexible and never make a concession without getting something in return. This is, from my perspective, the most important here. Then I would say we have 2 questions asked from our participants during our workshop. The first one is from Mrs. Magdalena Vigru. She has written, commercial negotiation with a big client. How do you bring a customer who is not willing to give you a position, whether he will agree on a given provisions or not? For instance, increase of prices, liability, etc. So how would we bring this client to move? Customer is basically not open to any negotiations, and his tactic is like playing the time.
I would say, if I may respond to this question very quickly, I would say if they are not willing to, at least from my experience and from my jurisdiction, if they are not willing to move anywhere, it's always good to find something to motivate them. Unless in our jurisdiction it doesn't work, if they're simply stuck, then either you have to find something that hurts them, that motivates them, or you have to come up with something completely new, offer them something that simply is attractive for them. Otherwise, you will stay in the position you are in, stuck.
I'd also say that maybe the factors time and power would play here a big role, because of course, if this is the biggest customer of your business, then I would say your negotiation room is really a tight one. You don't have much room for negotiation. If this is just one of your top 20 customers, let's say, then of course it depends also on the playing time, who has more time to play. If you are the one who has more time, then let the customer just play this way, and they would come back to you. And one follow-up question from Mrs. Magdalena Vigru, exactly time and power. They know we want the project. Do you have an example in your practice? So basically we have a company which wants to have a certain project with a certain customer, let's say almost at any price.
I think, Pavlina, the example you already presented with the plot at the sea was maybe similar to this situation a little bit. We also had a customer that was just like the plot, wanted to acquire the plot and was willing to pay some premium for it, if I understood correctly.
Yes, maybe they're just the opposite position.
Yeah.
The client is playing the ultimatum game situation with them, probably. I don't know. It's really hard. It's really hard to reply to such a request from a customer who is not willing to give you any position. I would, at your place, I would just try different offers. Do you accept this, or is it okay for this to do this? Just try to see which rings a bell, which is probably interesting for the customer to use it in the negotiations.
Yeah, I think it also depends whether you will collaborate also in the future with this client. Is it only a one-time project, or is there a potential for really a big collaboration with this client? And then basically, then you could, I would say, if this is a future big collaboration, then I would say, well, let's just think also about our future in 10 years. So it doesn't make sense to force me to play the ultimatum game right now, because in future we would be interdependent from each other. That's why I would say, okay, try to negotiate calmly again and radiate confidence and understanding for their needs. But then you can lower their expectation by saying, well, our goal is maybe to have future projects with each other. And right now, if you're so aggressive towards us, we would really think about, is this really a good collaboration? Mrs. Magdalena Vergruch has just clarified that this is a key customer. Well, in this case, it also depends from your past experience with the customer. If this is if something just changed within this contractual relationship from the one day to the other, I would really try to understand who is the key person behind this change of positions. This would be also helpful to directly speak with this person who now changes the rules of the game in your relationship. But it's really a very individual case. It must be really considered. There are many aspects to be considered there. And then we had another question from Mrs. Eva Kovatsova. What would you advise in a situation when your partner walks away from the deal, M&A deal, due to a dispute over critical clause? How would you advise to reopen the negotiation if you still want the deal, however, without giving up the critical clause? I mean, this is very similar to what we had as a question from Mrs. Magdalena Vigru. These are exactly these ultimatum situations.
Well, I would suggest here to check whether there is another clause in the agreement, which would be once again important, at least as important as the critical one, which you are able to amend in a way beneficial for the partner, and approach him and advise, look, this critical clause, it's really deal breaker for us, but we can amend this clause, which I know is interesting for you, so you will receive this condition, and are you okay to conclude an agreement with such content?
Yeah.
Well, as I said, if this concerns Slovakia, I would say, as I said, it's very, from my experience, it's very common if you are simply, if you can't get over a certain point or a certain clause or a certain item, it's usually hard to convince the other party with any rationale or with any, I don't know, counter offers to get over the point. You just, from what worked for me in the past was always to, as Pavlina mentioned, to make a complex out of the one issue, to not isolate it and make it, put it into a context with other things, and simply change the perspective, and then maybe you have a chance to go forward a little bit.
So then let's take a very quick look at our polls. Basically, on the first, as I understand. Oh no, we have, okay. So with respect to the first poll, the winner here is, how do you judge a successful negotiation? You get to an outcome which accomplishes the needs of both sides. 46% voted on this, and this is exactly the confirmation of our win-win negotiation concept, which we discussed. And the next one is the ultimatum game. Well, it is very interesting that exactly the limit of the ultimatum is about at 30 euro. And there was actually a psychological experiment with this ultimatum game, and this was exactly the result. Up to, between 50 and 30 euro, the proposals were accepted. Everything beneath it in the majority was rejected. Thank you very much for the participation in the polls. And then let's go to this very last and my favorite slide here. Well, I would say my message to our participants out there is that our commodity is basically our time. And this is also the commodity equal to the Warren Buffett's one. And that's why you have the choice. You can chase after a single deal for a long time, or you can take the deals with the people who are ready to do business with you right now. And in fact, there are enough people out there willing to do business with you right now. So maybe just chasing after a single deal would turn out to be a fool's ride. To my colleagues, last words.
Thank you very much also to everybody for your attention, and hope you have enjoyed today's workshop. At the end, I would just like to say what makes me feel like we've done a good job as advisors to a transaction, which is when I see the parties being happy about the deal they have just made. So if you make some friends along the way, it's just the icing on the cake.
Yes, thank you also for your time, and yes, happy clients, happy lawyers. So indeed, concluding a negotiation with positive results is such a great motivation for all of us. And along the way, with each transaction, we become more and more skilled in the art of negotiation.
Thank you for your time and for your attention. To our attendees, I would just like to add that attitude towards negotiations is what matters. Each time you enter into negotiations with positive attitude, trying to better understand the position of the other party, you already have all chances to achieve a win-win situation.
Big thank you to my colleagues, and a big thank you to all participants out there. Enjoy the rest of the day, stay healthy, and never be sure of what you want that you wouldn't get something better. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.